it was very interesting, the session about the body, and we know how is it, the complexity of the human body, and it is also more complicated, more unconsciousness. And so we try to discuss together all the aspects of dimension of a human being, of the human person, quid est homo, and with the perspective also of a dialogue, interaction, to understand this different dimension of the human being. And we start with Professor Gaia Novarino. She obtained the PhD in developmental biology from the University of Rome, La Sapienza, but she studied in Germany and also in San Diego in California. And in 2014, she joined the Institute of Science and Technology of Austria. And she became a full professor, and now she is also executive vice president of the Institute, and made important research on the molecular mechanism underlying human neurodevelopmental disorders. It was honored by Boehringer in the pharmaceutical company. And so, thank you for your contribution, and we start to analyze all the aspects of consciousness.
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to analyze all the aspects of consciousness because I would need also to understand it first. But definitely I want to talk a little bit about the development of the human brain. And that's what really I find it very fascinating. And to carry on a little bit of this fascination, I wanted to show you this picture, this video that you see here. This is a tiny little piece of the human brain, very tiny, so much smaller than the head of a needle. And this was reconstructed together with some collaborator of ours. And where you see all those colors, each of these colors and each of these fibers is a different cell. And to me, it's a wonder how those cells can find each other in a sort of, I wouldn't say deterministic, but precise way, and connect to each other, communicate with each other. And how this is happening for me is a true wonder. And we know that part of the instructions to carry on this job is it's written in our genes. And we know that neurodevelopment has certain stages. As simplification here, we know that we go through some proliferation, some differentiation. So first the cells need to become as many as make us our brain. And then they have to differentiate. They have to organize themselves, migrate in the right location, and connect to each other. Now, because we talk about genes, and I really like before there were already some discussion about that, I would like to point out that actually the genes is not really this unique arrow or unique path as is designed here, but they would just really define as a way to keep things on track, if you want, and but still those allow to a certain degree of variability. And I think this degree of variability is also what I really would like to talk about today, in a way that I think that diversity really stems to the fact that, we are all different brains and we are still functioning, but really we appreciate this diversity. So genes are really needed to keep them, the brain developing and working, but still giving this degree of variability. And in this framework, what I'm studying, or what my group is studying, is really our genetic mutations we talked about. Mostly, my lab focuses on those monogenic forms of development. So how mutations in single genes lead to problems during development that really we need to take care of. And I want just to bring one more controversial part of it, and that we are really working a lot on it, that are out in spectrum disorders. This is just an introduction. So this is a group of heterogeneous disorders, meaning that in the field we say once you have seen a kid with autism, you have seen one kid with autism, so that really there is a huge diversity. There are neurodevelopmental disorders. Those kids have difficulties in verbal and nonverbal communications, repetitive and strict adherence to rituals, hyper and hyposensory sensitivity, also a number of comorbidities such as anxiety, epilepsy, sleep problems. And we know that, as I mentioned before, that those are mostly genetic conditions of different complexity, but are the genetic conditions. And so what we do in the lab is try to understand and identify those genes that when mutated are really highly penetrant, so not the ones it was mentioned before, like the polygenic part, but the monogenic, so that we know if those genes are not working, we eventually have a disorder such as autism spectrum disorders. And so here are just some names over there, some cases in which we see in different patients mutations in different genes. And over the years, we have studied those genes to understand how mutations, so if you want to switch off those genes, how they are affecting those processes of proliferation, differentiation, organization, and connectivity. So very much molecular and cellular work. But as I mentioned before, this is a group of heterogeneous disorders, is a distribution. So the severity is varying a lot. My lab focuses quite a bit on or actually only on the severe cases. So in this part of the curve. But obviously this curve already asks us to ask the question, what is the boundary there? And I'm not going to enter into that, but just like to keep it in mind. But what I'm really curious, or what we are really curious also about right now, is to understand, if you just look at this part of the curve that are very severe, what are those individuals? What do they have in common? Do they have something in common? Because we say it's a group of heterogeneous disorders. Do they have something in common, or there are really many different disorders? And so to answer to these questions, recently we have picked many different genetic mutations in many genes linked to those disorders. And with those, we have generated models. And again, for models, we would need a separate session. But in this case, we have been using mice. This morning was mentioned cerebral organoids. We're also using those eventually. Again, models are models. So that's just that everyone understand. I think it's important. And using those models, we have been comparing those animals carrying mutations in different genes and try to understand how similar to each other they are and how diverse they are. And I'm just going to show you, so what the way we have done it is practically getting brain cells from those models, getting from each of these cells a molecular profile, or a finger, sort of a finger DNA print, if you want, and compare all those cells and this obtained from all those different models and see, look at how similar to each other they are. And so I'm just showing this graph. Here you look at developmental stages and different model systems, so different genotypes. And probably you can see that there are kind of two squares that are very clear, that in blue indicates that those models are very similar at certain developmental stages. But then as we move to the more mature brain, these squares disappear, indicating that those disorders, they are becoming a bit more diverse. And I would argue that they're probably something like, for instance, experience may kick in. And another way to show this diversity is that we measure in the brain the activity of the neurons. So we all have, hopefully you all have spiking neurons at the moment, right? So electrical activity. And if we just compare this electrical activity in 4 of those different models, and so here you see a curve of currents and voltage. So we inject current and we measure what is the voltage of the neuron. We see that the curve in all those different mouse models is completely different. So not completely, is roughly different, indicating that even within models that carry mutations for the same genetic conditions, we have a high degree of variability and diversity. And then I think it's important to talk about this, also about the difference between females and males. And this is something that in science for a long time has been completely disregarded. In fact, in our field, in neuroscience, for some reason, scientists have been studying just male mice. Just male mice. I mean, really, it's not just a joke, it's true. And so we wanted also to look at this, how being a female or a male could change this in animals and the effect of genetic mutations. And here just is a simple, is a graph to show that in different cell types, we see a certain number of processes that are affected by the genetic mutations that we are studying. But the all important things that you may want to take from here is that the graph in females and the graph in males is fundamentally different. Meaning that, in fact, we may not have to consider just the, if you want, individuality of those disorders and what they are, the commonality of those disorders, but also eventually the biological sexes and other effects and factors. So finally, before concluding, I kind of hint when I say experience. I also want to say that, I mean, genetic programs, I am a kind of geneticist, so obviously I trust that genetics is extremely important, but I also trust that environmental factors have a very important, they are affecting a lot, what is the outcome eventually of certain genetic mutation. Where we were talking before about polygenic scores, obviously, for instance, we can eventually change a bit the course of some of these disorders. And so, for instance, what we are very interested in understanding is how is resilience during pregnancies, not how to cure, but how to make eventually, so for instance, just simply as simple as reduce stress during pregnancy may be important to reduce the effect of certain genetic mutations, how nutrition affects, we were talking during lunch about that, and how eventually certain behavioral challenges and exposure to certain environments can change those effects. And so with that, I close just with a couple of questions. Like I was trying to criticize my field or kind of think about it. But it really, for me, it would be nice to understand and talk with you about which features count as suffering to be alleviated and which has difference to be instead understood and supported. And the other one is how do we draw boundaries of normality, especially around those traits that, like language and sociability and behavior in general, that are central, I believe, to human life, and yet they're expressing in many different ways without letting our terminology obscure the disability and the delegitimate research, which I think is very important to still be able to say I'm studying out in spectrum disorders because there are certain kids that are suffering, and yet and eventually also want to intervene on that if it is required. And when this is required, it's not my choice, and it should be a community choice probably. And with that, I just want also to put the picture of my group, because I think it's important always to remind ourselves that behind us there are always a group of diverse and intellectually inspiring people working with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for also this presentation. And so we will collect the questions and demand for our discussion. But I introduce now the second speaker, and is Vidas Balčius, more or less, a Catholic priest from Lithuania, and he studied and he worked as a medical doctor, and after that he became a moral theologian, and he studied at the Gregorian University in Rome, and since 2009 is teaching at the Pontifical Università Urbaniana here in Rome, professor of fundamental and special moral theology. Thank you for your presentation and another contribution to understand the moral consciousness.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. It's my pleasure to speak today about the human person and the status of consciousness in Christian ethics. Thanks for the invitation. Contemporary Christian theology, in dialogue with all people of goodwill, and adopting an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approach, continues its commitment to seeking the answer to the question, quid est homo? In the search for answers to this question, selected anthropological truth, considered morally relevant, will be examined, drawing on the one hand on the shared human condition, and on the other, of course, on the truth of faith. Human life is essentially vocational. Once brought into being, every human being is part of humanity and is called to embark on a journey towards fulfillment, becoming ever more fully what they have been from the beginning. Though this vocation is always unique to the individual, it is also inseparable from others. It is lived out within the relational reality that is constitutive of human personal nature. Since human nature manifests itself by unfolding dynamically through the stages of human development, self-awareness and awareness of such a vocation will also grow as specific milestones are reached. At the beginning of human existence, biological and physiological changes undoubtedly prevail. Subsequently, life itself is marked by manifestation of self-awareness and of awareness regarding the other and the surrounding world. Once the threshold of reason is reached, thanks to the intersubjective encounter, moral conscience will arise. It opens the possibility of embracing one's own life as a dynamic reciprocity of the recognizer, recognized, and recognized recognizer. At this point, I would like to make a few insights. First, regarding human nature as an active condition of possibility. Second, regarding states of consciousness and the personal status. And the third, reassuming the point of view of Christian ethics. Let's start with the first. The reality unifying the various stages of human development is human nature. This nature is not chosen, but conferred with the existence, always the same, even if it manifests itself through the unfolding of the diversity of signs specific to each age. Human nature, as mentioned previously, is shared by all human beings and reflects the depth that serves as the foundation of the common human. The fact that every human being comes into existence through relational reality confirms the thesis that human nature is fundamentally relational. In the philosophical and theological tradition, the truth recalled here encompasses the concept of the person, affirming that human nature, being constitutively relational, can be described as personal. It is this nature that constitutes the condition of possibility for developing as a human person and for being respected as such unconditionally and impartial. This argument is supported by the fact that development of the human being as a personal being is a continuous process. Without any qualitative leaps or changes in identity, the active potential present from the outset unfolds gradually. In other words, being generated for entering into existence, the nature of the new human being keeps in itself a generative condition. That is, becoming what a human being is from their beginning. Going on the second insight, the discussion could begin with the reasonable question. If the premise outlined above, that is, that human nature being constitutively relational is personal, is accepted as valid, what impact does this have on cases involving different levels of consciousness? Even though consciousness is a continuous spectrum, flowing fluidly through different intensities of being present to oneself, neuroscience generally distinguishes between two groups of states. First, the normal state of consciousness, which includes full wakefulness and physiological sleep with two principal reversible cycles, REM and non-REM. Then neuroscience refers to altered or pathological states of consciousness. For example, drug-induced states, hypnosis, the flow state on the one hand, and the minimally conscious state, the vegetative state, and coma on the other. Despite the differences, which, as we have noted, are quite evident, that the fact that consciousness as a phenomenon is a unified and continuous flow points to the previously mentioned condition of possibility as the foundation underpinning such unification. That is, it points to the question of the nature of human being. In this context, the question of the relationship between states of consciousness and the personal status of human being relates to the two major trends in recent bioethics. Unlike the so-called personalist approach, which in its reflection emphasizes the ground of being, the so-called empiricist, or better functionalistic, actualistic approach, based on verifiable functional characteristics with a view to recognizing the personal status of human being, draw inspiration, directly or indirectly, from the diversity of states of consciousness, thereby introducing a division within the human being. These approaches do not sufficiently consider the fact that consciousness presents itself as a phenomenon in which there are no clear and insurmountable boundaries between different mental states. Among the scholars operating within the functionalistic perspective, with a strong emphasis on the state of consciousness when assigning or denying personal status, the following may be cited by way of example: Fletcher, Warren, Parfit, Dennett, Tooley, McMahon. Proceeding to the third and final insight, and returning to the Christian ethics and the functionalistic actualistic approach in bioethics, we should ask two fundamental questions. First, does the human being, being personal by nature, gradually reveals this fact in accordance with the normal stage of human development, that is, the typical signs of each stage of development manifest what one has been from the beginning? This dynamism can be described as already and even more. And the second, does the human being become a person through a gradual process of personalization that must reach the thresholds identified as criteria for being classified as a person? That is, the status of personhood is attributed only if and when the functions or characteristics deemed essential are present. These passages can be described as not yet versus already. In this discussion, scientific data cannot provide a direct answer, but is of great importance for understanding the unity of human beings and the continuity of their development. Given the differences based on direct experience between a human being in the early stages of development and one in later stages of life, as well as the differences discernible between different states of consciousness, you might ask, from a Christian perspective, what kind of relationship would be ethically correct towards individuals who do not conform to the so-called criterion of normality because they appear to be not only different, but also too different. We know that the accepted criterion of diversity and the rejected notion of the substantial self has led and unfortunately continues to lead to the humanitarian disasters. Within the framework of the ethics of the gift, theological reflection continues to uphold as the only truly human relationship, the one which is based on welcoming the other with generosity and by giving oneself unconditionally and impartially. It could be summed up in a single word: love, caritas. This critical approach has an anthropological basis because it recognizes the other human being, regardless of their different states of consciousness, as an ever-present presence, which speaks even when it is silent. The question that the presence of the other different posed to us by virtue of being and being a human being transforms them in an ethical subject. The answer to the question inevitably involves the moral conscience of one who responds, knowing that in answering who is the other different to me, within the logic of reciprocity, I will be answering who am I. Finally, some generalizing comments for the conclusion. From a theological perspective, therefore, the unity of the value of human life and equality and dignity find their foundation in the theology of the creation of man in the image and likeness of personal God. Every human being, regardless of the stage of their development and the manifestation of characteristics or functions recognized as typical of the human person, has, on an axiological theological level, the same value conferred upon them by existence itself. At this level, no one can add or take anything away. Instead, as a moral subject, the human person is called to live in ever greater likeness to their being in the image of God through a growing self-awareness of themselves and of their own life, always in relation to the other, different from me, as a call towards the fullness of the humanity revealed in Christ. In addressing the issue raised, moral theology undoubtedly recognizes that moral conscience requires consciousness at its condition of possibility. One must be conscious to have moral awareness. In the case of a human being whose state of consciousness is compromised, their personal nature is not lost. Recognizing it as such, it is the responsibility of the conscious moral subject in the context of a reciprocal relationship, though asymmetrical yet genuine, between the one who recognizes and the one who is recognized. As mentioned previously, the generative personal nature of human beings also involves caring for others, fostering life, and supporting every single human being at every stage of existence and in every state of consciousness. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much also for this contribution. So we try as a kind of puzzle to combine many elements of our reflection. And now I introduce Marcello Massimini. He's also a medical doctor and he's a neurophysiologist and he studied at the University of Milan, professor at the University of Milano, scientific consultant of Fondazione Dognocchi, a fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. And his research is devoted to understanding the neuronal and network mechanism underlying physiological and pathological transition across global brain states. Please, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you really for this invitation, Renzo. I also want to thank all the speakers in the previous session because I've learned a lot. Really, it's been amazing so far. I'm also overwhelmed, so really full of information. And I will, put my bit here. And my role in the next 10 minutes, I think, is to highlight some of the scientific, clinical, ethical challenges involved in recognizing conscience, inferring conscience in human brains and beyond. And I'll take a very practical approach, starting with a very simple Cartesian plot, where you have on the y-axis consciousness. So in the first person perspective, we have a good definition, shared definition of what consciousness is whatever fades when we fall asleep, in dreamless sleep, or in deep anesthesia. Everything fades, fundamentally. So consciousness is synonymous of experience, of this feeling of being there that you have now, this feeling of existence that you have now with this noise, the ambulance, and the colors in the room. But also, you can have it tonight before falling asleep. Total silence, total darkness, no cognitive load, nothing happening, but you're there. And then it fades when you fall asleep, though. I know I'm conscious now. I know it will fade, my conscience, sooner or later tonight. If everything works well, it will recover tomorrow morning. And I don't have to demonstrate this to anybody. I mean, it's a given for me. The problem arises when I have to recognize or judge consciousness in others, because consciousness is private. I don't have access to internal mental state of other people and other beings, so we use proxies. And this is very important. We need to realize this. What do we use as a proxy is the observation of intelligent behavior. So we assume that there is some kind of direct relationship between intelligent behavior, that is doing the right thing at the right moment, basically, and being. There is some sort of relationship, and this is the underlying theme of my talk, between doing and being. So we judge being by doing what another system does, or being, or human does. We do this every time. We do this in intensive care medicine, emergency room. Somebody comes, eyes closed, covered in blood, and we ask, can you squeeze your hand, open your eyes? And if the patient opens his eyes, then we ask, what's your name, where do you live? And by the complexity of this input-output, sensory input, motor output response, doing, we judge consciousness. We have these coma recovery skills with numbers. We do this probably also more implicitly along the Scala Naturae. So fundamentally, we are more inclined to attribute consciousness, that is, capacity to suffer, to a dog, because it does things that we recognize as, response to commands and, shows emotions like we do, and less so to a jellyfish, naturally, because it's stereotypical behavior, not much doing. But we're in trouble already when we are faced with an octopus, for example, which is a weird alien being with many hearts and the brain distributed in the tentacles, and very smart, by the way. But also, things are getting more complicated because we are changing nature. So on the one hand, we are being very successful, sometimes aggressive maybe, with intensive care medicine. So we save lives and brains that 50 years ago would have probably not existed. And sometimes what's left is a brain that is isolated, paralyzed, or sensory deprived. So potentially conscious, but not much on the x-axis of doing. And on the other hand, we touched upon this, we are producing systems that are going very strong on the x-axis, but probably not much on the y-axis. So this is AlphaGo, the deep learning network, very successful, not a chatbot, not so impressive because it wasn't talking, although beating Lee Sedol at Go was a major thing. Then Lambda, a chatbot, and we are inclined to infer inner feelings to, because of talking, right? So this is it's obvious, it's very human to do this. But again, it's doing, and the engineer, I don't know if you remember the story, the engineer of Lambda claimed that maybe his software was conscious, he was made fun of and fired a week later, but then ChatGPT came. And now the debate is on, and so this is science, posing the question, is it conscious or not? So what is it? Joshua Bengio, one of the fathers of deep learning networks, European community, I could go on forever. This is us, scientists, neuroscientists, philosophers, sort of expert of consciousness, advocating the need for a better test for consciousness. Because the one we have is especially for artificial system, is the Turing test, which is great, but it's old. And by own admission of Turing, this is not a test for consciousness, it's a test for intelligence, by the way. So you're there, you know the Turing test. I don't need to explain that. If you cannot tell the machine apart from the other human in a conversation, then the machine is intelligent and then, maybe conscious. But this, this might be wrong. And so here we are with this need to infer consciousness and this necessity of using a proxy that is not really probably the right proxy or the right way to do this, because if we keep doing this, we are taking the risk of not seeing consciousness where consciousness is present, the patient's there, and to see consciousness when there is none. And this is a major mistake, and the temptation is there. So there is already a push, and it's an interesting, to understanding why this is happening. It's a long discussion, but it's interesting to attribute moral status and welfare to AI, which is clearly premature, especially because we have not resolved that problem, the problem of patients. So maybe we should focus on that first. But there are also other reasons, and it's very interesting. So this is what I normally, this is my field. I know it better, and I just want to spend a few words about this. So sometimes, what survives is a brain that is isolated from the external world, no inputs, no output, difficult to judge from the extrinsic perspective of functions. And we know that consciousness can be generated within, without sensory input, sensory output. We know because we dream. There are many reasons for being sure that consciousness can be generated from within the skull without inputs and output. And thus, there is a possibility of these islands of consciousness that are not recognized, which is ethically and clinically a burning question. And so we need to develop better radars. They should go beyond behavior, motor output, sensory input, executive functions, something that taps directly into the physics of the brain. And it's difficult. We have good radars for looking outside, faraway stars outside of a galaxy, but we have struggled when it comes to detecting consciousness in the physical brain, especially when we try to squeeze out consciousness from physical of the brain. This is the famous heart problem of consciousness. Although there are progresses. And I want to show you one example. It's an alternative approach. It's a theory that does not squeeze consciousness out of the brain, but it takes consciousness itself as the primary fact. So this theory, called information integration theory, says when it comes to consciousness, you start from consciousness itself. You start from phenomenology. Consciousness exists, is the best material, the most direct thing that you can know. So you start from there. So you start from phenomenology. And then, if the physical world exists, and it's reasonable to assume that it exists, and if you want to minimize error and detect consciousness in the physical world, you take the phenomenological properties and then try to see if where the physical world matches the properties. So simplifying, brutally this theory, the theory recognizes unity and richness of information as fundamental properties of consciousness, and then says, well, if you have to look into physical systems, patients or other systems, behavior, don't trust behavior, but look for this physical properties that are matching the phenomenological properties. It's a primacy of consciousness. It's called consciousness first approach. First consciousness, it's almost an ontological position. Then you look to in the physical world for ethical, clinical reasons. And so the idea is to measure and to detect this very delicate balance between unity and diversity, the richness and the unity. And it's like, metaphorically speaking, like an orchestra, gigantic orchestra with different elements interacting like one. This is a metaphor, though, but we need to measure this balance in real brains. And so there are practical approximations to minimize error. It's not to measure, define consciousness. It's to minimize error, to see consciousness beyond behavior. So one potential approach is to, we say in Italian, dare la all'orchestra. I guess it's give the A, but I don't know if it's the right way to say it in English. It's to kickstart the orchestra with a magnetic pulse. This is an orchestra made of neurons. So we start neurons directly in the cortex. We bypass sensory input, motor output with a magnetic stimulator, and then we record the brain symphony, which is an electrical symphony. If the brain is unitary and diverse, like an orchestra, the symphony is complex, and then we measure the kind of complexity. So, just to give an example, when you are awake and the orchestra is working as a unitary and diverse system, the response is actually very complex. This can be demonstrated empirically. And when we fall in dreamless sleep or deep anesthesia, it breaks down, and you have this very simple local response of the orchestra. So we can measure this balance between unity and diversity. It's very coarse, but it's correlating pretty well with the states of consciousness: wakefulness, dreaming, high complexity, and then anesthesia, deep sleep, when people wake up and say, I didn't exist as far as I can tell, low complexity. And then once you validate and calibrate this measure in these benchmark conditions, you can take it to the bedside and make an inference when otherwise the patient would be unconscious, unresponsive. So you want to detect more than what's in there. And this is an example of application. I'll just show a movie for the sake of time, but it's quite, I think, indicative of what happens. This is a patient who's by all means unconscious. That would be a vegetative state. Decisions are taken at this stage in the intensive care medicine setting. All exams are negative. There are so many exams that you can do, EEG and so on, but this is positive. Now it's difficult. I realize it's not easy to see, but this wave looks like that wave. So it's in the conscious benchmark distribution. There are numbers, there are quantifications, but that's the thing. So this patient, this is a red flag. It's a safety net that says, no, wait, this patient is probably conscious, but it's completely locked in. There's no way you can demonstrate that. And actually, in fact, after 3 weeks, the patient was able to recover eye movements, so transition from a complete locked-in syndrome to a locked-in syndrome and communicate through the computer and communicate. And you see the ethical relevance of this and the consequences. So this shows that there are indeed dissociations. So there are patients that are really poor on the x-axis, but actually there, and we need to see them. It's about 20% of patients. And on the other hand, I want to just conclude by, a little reflection on AI. Am I very late? 2 minutes? Oh, enough. Okay. So 2 minutes about AI. It's good because I'm not an expert here. But I just want to, as a neurophysiologist, there is a little thing that I think I would like to share. So where do we put it? I mean, in principle, if we assume the relationship, we should be pretty high on the y-axis. But now, let's look inside our skulls. So we have about 100 billion neurons in our brain. 20 billions are in the cerebral cortex, thalamocortical system. Thalamocortical system is organized in a way, and surprise, 80 billions are in the cerebellum. So 3/4 of our neurons are in the back here, in the small structure, in volume, big in numbers. The cerebral cortex is organized in a way that is fully integrated and differentiated, like the orchestra. We know that by anatomy and clinical and neurophysiology and all this, and we know it's the basis for consciousness somehow. What about the cerebellum? Well, the cerebellum is way bigger in terms of numbers. It's super smart. So if I'm talking now, I'm not saying fluently, but with a decent flow, while I have just a general idea of what I'm about to say is because of the cerebellum. If Sinner catches a serve ball from 200 kilometers per hour, it's not because it's consciously seeing the ball. It's a prediction of the cerebellum based on how the opponent moved. And if I drive from here to Milan talking to my friend and somebody is driving, it's not me, clearly, better than a Google car. It's mostly because the cerebellum, if I have an intuition sometimes, it's because of the model that the cerebellum is building. It's a powerful, super smart, super fast machine, but it has a problem. It is completely unconscious. We know that because you can remove the cerebellum, that is 3/4 of our neurons, from the brain. There are deficits, motor, cognitive deficits, but the subject is vividly conscious, walks away vividly conscious. You cannot do this with the thalamocortical system. No neurosurgeons would remove the thalamocortical system and leave a cerebellum in the skull. Well, this is almost, it's interesting, of course. So one would like to know what's the difference. And coarsely speaking, the cerebellum is very modular, It's a lot of neurons, but it's modular. There's no unit in there. I teach neurophysiology. I know this, but if you read textbook, it's in there. It's not explicitly stated, but it's modular. And what about artificial system or neural networks? Well, so far, the way they are they more similar to the cerebellum or the thalamocortical system? Definitely to the cerebellum. We're not simulating the brain as the cortex. We are reconstructing in parallel, AI people are reconstructing big cerebellum. And if you put side by side the diagram of the cerebellum with the error signal and all the deep layers, and a deep learning network is just the same, really. It's very, very similar. And the cerebellum is unconscious. So the inference would be temporarily that these systems, as far as we can tell, and in their current version, they stand very little chance of being conscious. So they probably should be here for the moment. Although some people think they should be up there. There's an ongoing debate, which is very, very interesting. It's also, quite hot between theories and neuroscientists, basically computational functionalists, that are saying, no, these systems are almost conscious, if not already conscious. And other people saying, no, it takes more than that. Consciousness is not an algorithm, it's not a computation. It's very interesting. Whatever the outcome, whatever, the real thing is that even if these systems are not conscious, they will pretend to be conscious. They will. There is a push to pretend. And it's an economical push. It's also some sort of, there's many cultural reasons for that. And this is dangerous. And we need to resist, because it's like a reflex. If somebody talks to you, somebody is very patient with you, or you are drawn to this. And there are issues of many things: responsibility, priorities, dilution. If we attribute consciousness to these systems, then it's diluted, the concept itself. And I think most important thing that worries me the more, having children, is the manipulation aspect, trust that you put in these systems. That's all. I just want to thank, my lab and all the people working on this experimental part that I didn't, dig into too much. And thank you for your patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we'll discuss this role of cerebellum. That things more important than the brain. So, and we'll see about that. Probably you have already understood that one of the contributions in each session is coming from a young scholar, postdoctoral, so as Monica Consolandi, Diego Puricelli, and now we have Hope Kean. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and where she studied the neural architecture of human reasoning. And her research investigates how abstract, structured cognitive capacities are organized and realized in the brain. So it's very interesting how to understand these experiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, okay, thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation, Monsignor, Professor Ralph and Stephanie. I've had a great time, and I really enjoyed hearing from everyone today. It was really a lot of fun. My research focuses on the neural architecture of reasoning, but I actually want to start with a statistic that hits close to home for me, having spent more than a decade in the field of neuroscience, and that is that 1 in 3 young people who leave the church say that a primary reason was a perceived conflict between their scientific and religious beliefs. I find that really interesting. For the church, obviously, this is a problem. And as a scientist, I actually find it especially unfortunate because this conflict is really an illusion. And if we just try to drill down a bit to the root of this issue, we find a case, I believe, of mistaken identity. And it's the deeply mistaken, actually, misidentification of science with a philosophical framework, one called materialism, and religion with a philosophical framework, one called dualism. Now, it is entirely true that materialism and dualism are incompatible with one another, but science is not materialism and religion is not dualism. In fact, Western science and theism are incompatible with both of these extremes. When we actually look at the landscape of how the mind relates to the brain and the philosophy of mind, there's a wide spectrum. And to be clear, the neuroscientific data that I'm going to present to you today does not rule out everything in this landscape. There are nuanced positions here in the middle, like emergentism and epiphenomenalism, and they all remain part of an ongoing and very robust debate. But the cultural narrative around neuroscience and the one driving the next generation of thinkers away is dominated almost entirely by these extremes, reductive materialism on the left and strict dualism on the right. So today I want to look at a particularly illuminating domain to test these extremes. When we investigate the neural architecture of human reasoning, which is my primary research focus, we see in high definition how both materialism and dualism are inadequate to the task of explaining actual neuroscientific data in practice, which we're going to take a look at now. So my work in this area spans two parallel discoveries. The first comes from the logic study, the findings of which are incompatible with substance dualism, and the second is the interesting brain study, which is incompatible with reductive materialism. So let's start with the logic study. This involves finding healthy, neurotypical adults, people like yourselves, and putting them inside of a brain scanner, inside of which we have them do complex reasoning tasks, such as logical induction and deduction. Now, usually this spans multiple hours or even multiple days. I'm not going to subject you to all of that, but I do want to show you what it's like to be in the scanner. So you would be looking at a screen, very much like this one. And first, I'm going to have you do inductive reasoning, which is reasoning from a specific example to a general rule. So for this task, we use something called program induction. And what that involves is seeing an input list, such as the one here, which is a set of numbers, 333. And there's a secret rule, a hidden rule, that generates the output. And the output here is just 333. So you might guess that the hidden rule is something very simple, like, give me the output. But then I show you another example, and I ask you to generate an output, and you use a special button box that we had to specially order with 10 digits and extra buttons for enter and backspace. And you might enter 21, which is the input. But I tell you that the hidden rule generates 1, 2. Now you might have a new guess as to what the secret rule is. But then I give you a final example, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that becomes 4, 3, 2, 1. Now you're probably pretty confident that the rule is reverse the list or flip the list. So this game taps inductive processing and has been widely used in the computer science as well as the cognitive science literature. But now we want to test logical deduction as well. For this, we just use classic syllogisms such as all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore what do you know with deductive certainty? Therefore Socrates is mortal. And if we put this into a conditional format, this is the classic template modus ponens, which all of you are probably familiar with. We just used verbs and words of arbitrary content, such as blocks and squares and colors and sizes. And we also used a template called modus tollens, which is a slightly more difficult form of the syllogism, and asked people to judge their validity. So this is the logical induction and logical deduction task that we had people do in the scanner. And what we discovered is a highly specific set of areas in the interior-most part of the frontal cortex that responds robustly to these logic tasks. So this is a pretty astonishing finding. For centuries, the rational human capacity for pure logic was theorized by many, including dualists, to be an entirely immaterial process or not reducible to any brain state. Yet here we are looking at a physical, biological, a neural system that is specifically for implementing abstract logic. So this is not showing that logical truths themselves are physical, because they can't be. When you grasp that 2 + 2 = 4, or the conclusion that necessarily follows, you're grasping something universal and immaterial and transcendent. But this does show that there's a physical neural system in the brain that is attuned to recognize these logical truths. And it's an embodied organ for a rational cognitive power. But we want to understand this new system a little bit better. And to do that, we can look at diverse tasks for logical reasoning. So for instance, we can replace those syllogisms words, instead of with real words like a ball or a block, with fake words or non-words, such as those found in the Jabberwocky poem in Alice in Wonderland. So the sentences look something like this. If the tep is plob, then it is not ag. The tep is plob. The tep is not ag. So this does not refer to anything in the real world. However, you can still reason about these variables in the exact same way. Now the question is whether or not the neural system responds in the same way to these syllogisms. And what we see, quite robustly over our study, is the exact same pattern of response, regardless of the syllogistic format. But we wanted to take that a step further. So we replaced the subjects and predicates not just with non-words, but with symbolic forms, iconic symbols such as circles, and adjectives like a color splotch. And what we see, perhaps not surprising anymore, is the exact same pattern of response in these areas. But that's just deduction. Let me show you the data from induction using the program induction task I just showed you. Here we see, once again, the same pattern of response, a greater response to the critical versus the control condition. And finally, we're going to use this canonical form of reasoning, matrix reasoning, used widely in cognitive science and psychology. And again, we see the same pattern of response to matrix reasoning. In further work, we also tested mathematical reasoning, but I don't have time to get into that right now. So what we see is that this logic system, a neural system, is involved in all these different forms of complex abstract reasoning for induction, deduction, and even the complex math. And amazingly, this system continues to function perfectly even in patients who have suffered massive strokes to their language areas. And so they have lost almost their entire ability to speak and to understand language. And perhaps most intriguingly, these exact regions lie outside of the executive or domain general multiple demand network, the one that we share with non-human primates. And in fact, these areas have no clear analog priorly established in non-human primates at all. So what does it mean that this physical component enabling abstract logic exists on the surface of our cortex? I want to take a look again at the spectrum. I believe it means that a strict dualism is not tenable, especially versions like Cartesian dualism, which posit that the physical and mental are two entirely separable realities that bear no relation to each other, that they only touch at a single point, or really any theory that thought is purely non-physical. If that were true, we would not expect, at least for simplicity, a reliable, highly specific biological system to come online uniquely for abstract reasoning. Our reasoning capacity relies on a physical substrate. But does that mean that the brain is nothing but material interactions? Does this commit us to a reductive form of materialism? For this, I want to turn to my second study, the interesting brains. These are people alive today with massive congenital lesions to their brains, yet they have absolutely no detectable behavioral abnormalities. They don't look or behave differently than you or me. I could have one of these lesions. And the prevalence of these lesions we estimate to be around 1 in 500, although there's been no systematic study of this population because it's not detectable. Meaning statistically, someone walking through St. Peter's Square right now probably has a brain like this and has no idea. This population is really amazing. In addition to their atypical brains, our specific cohort actually displays above average linguistic as well as cognitive function. And this is in the largest homogeneous cohort within this people scanned. To be clear, they were recruited through a New York Times article, so it is a selective sample. And when we look at their functional networks, perhaps most surprising of all, we see something incredible. Their cognition isn't the only thing that is preserved. The fine-grained architecture of their cognitive systems remains perfectly intact, like a blueprint asserting itself despite these massive physical deformations. So I want you to take a look at this participant. She has a cyst the size of a grapefruit. I don't know what the word for that is in Italian, actually, but right where her logic network should be. It has completely displaced and squished the left frontal lobe. Traditional accounts of neuroplasticity would predict that either the other side of her brain would take over, or under a massively pluripotent account in which all cells can take over any other function within the brain, the logical functions would be taken up in a distributed form outside of the lesion-affected area. But that's not what we see. Instead, her logic network is entirely intact, functioning perfectly, highly specific and selective to logical reasoning. It has architectural integrity, and it has merely migrated to adjacent cortical tissue. This finding renders very naive neural determinism absurd. If there's a strict identity relation between our specific atoms or neurons and their configuration with our mind, then even small variations in that configuration should produce changes in mental function. These extreme cases show more drastically that massively deforming the cellular configuration has the possibility to not alter mental functioning at all. Furthermore, we see that this architectural blueprint of disentangleable cognitive systems asserts itself despite the deformations, compressions, and shifting. And so we see that a higher order formal principle of organization is visibly at play. We can see it in our brain scans, constraining the material biology. So I want to take a look at this spectrum one last time. Taken in tandem, these findings put immense pressure on the two extremes, the ones most commonly equated with the scientific worldview or the religious worldview. And the data pushes us away from these poles and towards one of these middle positions. I call these the structural realist positions. And there's a lot of modern debate in the philosophy of mind around emergentism, epiphenomenalism, and non-reductive physicalism. And these are active areas of research. But I want to suggest, and these are just some of the thinkers that I don't think we can dive into right now, but I want to suggest that this data does lend itself quite naturally with a biological and neurobiological realist position, an account of the human person as a biological living organism. Hylomorphism is the form of this that was first articulated by Aristotle and then developed throughout the Western and Near Eastern scientific as well as theological communities. And under this view, we are not immaterial souls trapped inside of prisons made out of meat, as a great dualist named Plato once said, nor are we merely sophisticated biological machines, a sum of randomly generated parts without a whole, as Daniel Dennett and others have maintained. Instead, we are rational animals. And by rational, I mean that we reason with a specialized neural architecture oriented towards grasping universal forms, logical necessity, and abstract truths, such that we have the capacity to contemplate things like infinity and justice and other abstract and transcendental realities, and animals, because we are embodied, organic, and living beings. Our cognitive powers require specific material structures, and we think through our biology in a real sense. Young minds are still choosing to leave the church because they think it conflicts with science. However, from this viewpoint, science is actually pointing us towards exactly what a very perennial tradition has long maintained. It may be a modern scientific articulation, but it is a perennial idea that we are deeply integrated and unified beings with form and matter and soul and body. But in this view, the soul is not a ghost in the machine. It is, in fact, a relatively thin notion, one of an organizing principle or blueprint of the living organism, which is traditionally in biology characterized as by having modular or hierarchical structure, a feature that's present in all biological forms, and which is in practice quite axiomatic in neurobiology. And this also matters beyond neuroscience and philosophy of mind. It matters also for human dignity as well, for how we care for those with neurological disease as whole persons and not just as broken parts. And it's also important for how we understand what it means to flourish as embodied persons, and also for how we understand ourselves. So in our quest to answer quid est homo and qui est homo, I believe that neuroscience, philosophy, and theology have something to say, and they are not separate domains competing for territory. There are three ways of pursuing one truth, which is really one reality, which we're all sharing in, and what we discover about neurons, about rational capacities, or about the soul. These are not contradictory realities that are in tension. Instead, they're just dimensions of one reality, and each discipline needs the data and insights of the others to reach the whole truth. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. So thank you very much also for this presentation. So we had in this session three scientific contribution coming from science, different perspective, and one from theology. I think it is interesting to analyze which kind of interpretation of human being, which interpretation of brain and consciousness. It could be also interesting what is really human consciousness is not only a problem of brain, or it is a brain in the body. So we have a more complicated issue about what is consciousness in the human being, but it inside the body, and there is the influence of all the body in this experience. So in the old tradition, most prevalent place of consciousness was the heart. And so what is the meaning of that? But please, we open the discussion, which way to understand the consciousness, what is the role of a brain, and the problem, how the brain is working, about logic and reasoning and all the aspects that were presented, and which kind of questions are still present for theology and for our discussion. Please, there is one question, please.
So apologies if the question is a bit dumb, but if we were able to demonstrate a status of permanent, irreversible unconsciousness in the way that scientifically was defined, so what would be the argument that the person would still be, in a way, a man?
Or a woman.
Or a woman, say a homo in this sense. So related to human, sorry. Related to what's presented by, Vidas.
Please, if you, but also Massimini, okay.
If you noted, I begin my presentation on speaking about human nature as a condition of possibility. So, of course, I wanted to explain two approaches present in actual bioethics, two big approaches. See, the first one founded on the being of human being and human nature as such. The second one founded on the functions and characteristics recognized as important for attributing the state of personal status. So the difference is collocated in this level. If I don't accept that human nature is personal nature as a condition of possibility, I don't say that embryo and adult are similar in the phenomenological level. No, but my personal nature, if it wouldn't be personal from the beginning, it would be difficult to explain why I am a person as adult. Then I can lose some functions, can lose some characteristics, but my nature doesn't change. So you see, of course, your question, totally unconsciousness. It is one of the functions, but human nature remains human nature. You do not accept my proposition. It is not my proposition, of course, but you see the differences in this level. I used a condition of possibility, generative human nature, active potentiality, because from the very beginning, I am a being of human nature. See, I am a human being. And of course, it would be necessary to make some explications how the theology understand the concept of person with the analysis of the Trinitarian theology and Christology, but and then creation of human being as an image and likeness of God. So if this premise is not accepted, of course, it is very, very difficult to argue, because it depends how I understand person.
Please, Massimini.
Yes, I think there are two levels that are, it is important to distinguish. So on a scientific level, I think it's very interesting, your question and the entire discussion, because we need to reflect on the fact that consciousness is very easy to demonstrate. It exists. We are certain about it. Although there are eliminativist positions, there are, it can be denied. Some people, computational functionists, will end up denying consciousness. But at the end, it's the only thing we're sure about. Demonstrating unconsciousness is tricky because I said, and it's one of the basis of our calibration of measures, that deep sleep is unconscious and that deep anesthesia is unconscious. But actually, it is very difficult because maybe you woke up and forgot. So you're not remembering a dream. You were there somewhere, but you just don't remember. So having a benchmark and a calibration for unconscious is not easy. And we are oscillating between two extremes in the, I think, society, community. On one hand, minimally conscious patients are now, somebody is proposing to call them cortically mediated state, just to deny consciousness to minimally conscious, because they're not very functional. That would be a very much X-axis approach. On the other hand, some people are saying, well, consciousness never fades. Well, if it never fades, then everything is conscious. And then there is a dilution issue. And I'm not talking about the resources and the practicalities of medicine, where you need to make choices. And that's the other level. So, at the end of the day, prognosis is important because you have to invest your limited resources. But this is obvious. That's another discussion. Yes. And of course, that's another story. But talking more on a philosophical, scientific point of view, we need to realize we are living these two extremes. And I think the two extremes, we were talking about threshold before, they're not good either. I mean, in one case, you are denying consciousness. In the other case, you are diluting it. I think it's very interesting. It's a profound issue that it has to do with the threshold that was brought up before a little bit.
Thank you. Stefano Simplici. Sorry.
Okay, I have a question that goes across Marcello and Hope. So, Marcello, you mentioned, the unconscious part of the brain, cerebellum, you call it, has a different structure from the cortex, that is the conscious part. So this means that I'm doing some deduction here. It means that if I be able to build a machine, AI, with the same structure of the cortex, I will have a machine that is conscious. Is that correct? And then comes the point about hope. You mentioned about the logical network. I was wondering, that logical network what are the specific characteristics? Is it different? It seems to work in a very different way than the rest. Has different property, different structure, like in the case of cortex or not?
Okay, Paolo, thank you. No, the evidence is that the cortex has the right causal, internal, intrinsic causal structure, and the cerebellum is like dust. It's an aggregate. It's an illusion of unity. It has a name. It has book chapters. You can hold it in your hand, but it's not unitary. It's an ontological mistake. It's an aggregate of many systems. It's not one system. Somebody would argue that the thalamocortical system is actually the largest unitary system that exists in the universe, the way it's organized, which is, it's by the physical point of view, it's already something. It's it's larger than any planet, any galaxy, and everything. But if you were to build and replicate a thalamocortical system, not to simulate though, so According to some views, simulation would do nothing. You could take the Human Brain Project and simulate with mean field models the entire brain. It would do the same functions, everything. Or you could simulate the functions with a purely feed-forward system, but that would be a cerebellum. But if you do it also, if you were to simulate with the right organization, unitary organization like the thalamus cortex, that would be a simulation. It's not a physical implementation, it's not an emulation, and the simulation, simulating a store will not get you wet, simulating a black hole will not distort time and space, they say. So you would need to emulate, and that gets into the neuromorphic computer part, which is super complicated and very unstable, and we are very far from that. So the answer is in principle, but it has to be physical, and it gets very difficult.
Hope, do you have a comment?
Oh, yes. So the areas that I identified in the anterior frontal cortex, I mean, actually relating very much to the cerebellum. As you said, the cerebellum is much denser than the rest of cortex, but that principle actually plays out across the cerebrum as well. So at the back of the brain, the dorsal occipital lobe, cortex is much more dense. The neurons are more densely packed. And as you move anteriorly towards the front of the brain, things become more sparse. There are fewer neurons per cubic millimeter, and additionally, the number of neurotransmitters present is lower. And part of this is due to the cortical mantle expansion that happened in the early human period. At one point, our skulls expanded, and we were able to have a vastly larger forehead, but also brain in the frontal cortices. So these regions lie in that cortical mantle expansion area. And that's why I said that there aren't clear analogs in non-human primates, because they didn't undergo that cortical mantle expansion. And this is a much less dense cytoarchitectural area. In any case, there's other things I could say, but I'm just going to leave it at that.
Professor Novarini?
Yeah, maybe just to add, because I mean, one thing is to know what consciousness is. One thing is to know what the neuronal substrate of consciousness is. And at the beginning today in the keynote, there was this discussion about the cerebral organoids. And cerebral organoids is perfect example between simulation and modeling. Actually, it's modeling, it's not simulation. And we can do now these cerebral organoids of the cortex, of the cerebellum, of different brain areas, and even put them together to model a cross-communication across brain regions. I would argue, although I think that we should have this conversation, I would argue that yet we cannot claim at all that those models are conscious at all. And so I think it's an interesting conversation, but again, it's a simple model, and one of the problems is that we don't know how is consciousness really emerging.
Thank you. Stefano,
my question was precisely the same. So I could give up. Just a couple of supplementary observations. First, if we have to compare the AI system structure to the cerebellum structure, we immediately face a further issue. The task that the AI systems are able to perform, far outpacing humans, are not to overlap to the tasks of cerebellum. So this, in my opinion, this could make things a bit more complicated. And a second question, what about self-consciousness? Never heard during this panel. Is it a concept to simply get rid of?
Please. Please.
So about the cerebellum, so if I understand correctly the question, AI systems are designed for different functions than the cerebellum. True. Although the cerebellum is involved in language, prediction, it's prediction. I mean, it's specifically, it's not general intelligence, the cerebellum, but it's specific So, I mean, it depends. The same architecture can work in different domains, and the cerebellum developed for some domains. Interesting, the cerebellum developed with us, and slowly, in a way that is super well harmonized with our brain through evolution. AI are developing outside their cerebellum that are not really. So, but yes, I think there are, I just want to stress the similarity, because normally, it is assumed that you are stimulating the cortex, the brain that we are, but actually it's probably not. And this is an interesting discussion, but I take it.
This is why I consider this part absolutely crucial.
Yeah, but I totally take your point. And then self-conscious, then I'm done, because, but it's dear to me, and I stay away from that. Not because I'm not interested, not because I think it's not interesting. Actually, it's one of the main, our experience and our flow daily. There's a lot of self-conscious, but I think it's diverting us from the key issue. That is, to me, the key question is, the mystery is when you hold the brain in your hand during an autopsy, is you wonder not so much about self-conscious. How is it possible this object and host somebody who sees pure black and silence, but who feels like being there, this intrinsic sense of existence. Self-conscious comes later. It's beautiful, it's what we are, it's probably super important, but the mystery to me is that. And if you take it to self-conscious, you're raising the bar for consciousness, especially when you want to detect it. So I want to keep the bar pretty low. But I think it's a fascinating topic, obviously.
Thank you. Probably the last question, because time is running, and so please.
So an easy question, very easy. So from what we have discussed, are there ways that you can see what you have learned being applied to people in the hospital, in our care, traumatic brain injury, where we currently think at a situation that there is no hope for this? But then when you look at these scans of the people who have large sections missing, so, I mean, is there now a different sense of what's possible in terms of healing, or at least potentially rewiring people that have experienced this, amazing injuries?
I ask to all speakers if they wanted to say something.
I can talk from at lunch we talk about gene engineering, right, and gene therapy, and I would still argue, and that's what I was also thinking when Ope was presenting, some of those things, whether they are coming, at what stage of development and at what stage of life they are coming up. I think this is something that we still need to understand, so it's when to intervene. And so, for instance, if someone grew up with such a cyst that eventually enlarged but was always there, eventually is developing ways to compensate for that, and you will never need to treat that. And so understanding, I would say that there are nowadays new technologies to intervene, but the timing of it is probably still under, we need still to understand much about that.
Vidas.
Okay. It is not the question, a theological question, but I would like to change a little bit perspectives. See, of course, for me, it is not the question, how to say, the important injury of the brain. Of course, the question is, for me, this subject is a personal subject or not? And your question about the possibility of healing, for me, it is a sign that you see in this subject a person, and it is necessary to take care of him. Then I don't know what would be the result from the medical point of view, but from the ethical point of view, the mode to create the relationship with this patient, of course, is this one specific for the so-called ethic of the gift.
Care.
Of care, of course. Gift, care.
Days of care.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. In the patients that we have who have aphasia, so stroke-induced loss of language, we find these preserved logical abilities, whereas for a long time, people with aphasia were thought to primarily have an intellectual disability. So it's not, I think, nearly as profound as people with locked-in syndrome, but I think it is a type of locked-in syndrome in that you have a mind that is fully cognitively active but unable to communicate. So I think that a lot of what neuroimaging can do for us is tell us more about what is still structurally intact interiorly, and the fact that that does correspond to these mental functions is sort of a gift because you can target therapies more directly. Well, for a long time, aphasia therapies were targeted at just increasing exposure to language stimuli, but that doesn't work because you have no language cortex to receive that stimuli. So finding workarounds that target intact systems, even if you can't tell from behavior that they're present, will bear more fruit. Yeah, so.
Thank you. Massimini.
Yeah, interesting question. I think most of the effort we do also, we talk about diagnosis, we talk about prognosis, but we want to understand mechanisms. And understanding mechanisms is key for thinking about new therapeutic strategies and new interventions. So for example, we are understanding that after brain injury, parts of the brain, even if you're awake, they're falling asleep and they go offline to protect themselves, but also they are offline. So there's a trade-off between protection and loss of function, and it's all to be understood. But yeah, mechanism, we didn't talk about them, but that's why we're here, mostly.
So many thanks to our speakers. I think it was an interesting session, also this. And we enter more and more in the mystery of a human being and who is, and quid est homo is a more and more open question about that.